we're into the slides, right?
Recording. 7. Hello, everyone. I'm gonna just take a minute or two here to get settled in for folks to join in on the webinar before we get started, and make sure folks have all the technical aspects of the webinar working. So just give us one moment. All right, let's do some technical checks to make sure everyone can hear everything. Can anyone hear me right now? If so, okay, I'm getting cool. I'm getting some yeses that people can hear me through the chat box. So if you haven't already, find that chat box. It should be somewhere on the bottom. If you can't hear, definitely give a shout out on the chat box, and we'll see what's up. But it looks like everyone can hear. Cool. If you haven't already tested out the chat box, why don't everyone chime in about where are you watching from, for folks to kind of see where we're all at. I see Seattle, I see Kennewick, I see real close by. We have Spokane, Tacoma, Olympia, wonderful. All right, and there's also a Q&A box, which we'll leave some time for at the end. We'll have some opportunities and questions for folks to chime in on the chat box during, but otherwise, save those questions for the end, and with the whatever remaining time we have left, we'll dive in. So, hello and welcome officially. My name is Omid Bagari, Director of Equity and Community Partnership with Just Lead Washington. And I'm here with my colleague, Ada Shen Jaffe, which will be helping me with today's webinar.
Hi, everybody.
We are both with Just Lead Washington. Just Lead Washington is here in Washington State, focus on equity and social justice, but really focusing on building a network of leaders across the state, particularly in the law and justice community, to really advance and move our collective work towards racial justice and social justice generally in our work, and other folks who are invested in advancing equity in their own work in different sectors. This is a little preview of what today's agenda will be. Our webinar will focus on structural racism and systems thinking today. I'm going to take us through kind of some foundational terms on what is structural racism, and kind of give not a full account of a history of race and racism, but really cover those foundational pieces, and hopefully give people some new questions and some new areas that they'd like to explore more with the history, because there's definitely a lot of it. In particular, I'll touch on the residential segregation piece across Washington State. And then Ada is going to come and bring in how that relates to systems thinking, what it is, and how to use it. And before we get into our Q&A approach. You might also see, to mention Jennifer Wardell, our Executive Director of Just Lead Washington, who is here on the chat box. So they might be answering some questions. If you send it out on the chat box, Jen will be here to kind of support on that front. So just take note of that. Jen's just next door helping us out for today. There she is. All right. So with that said, let me jump in to the day. So first off, this is a Washington Race Equity Justice Initiative webinar. And for those who don't know what the REGI for short focuses on is really building towards that vision of seeing and dismantling inequities and structural racism in particular. REGI has a particular interest in kind of doing that work in the law and justice community. So we have a core group of REGI partners from across the state who are committing to commitments and acknowledgments that structural racism it plays a huge role in our country's history and the systems that we are a part of and that we're working to change, which is exactly what we're going to get into today. We also want to plug one of our most recent pieces that we've developed is the Organizational Race Equity Toolkit, developed with the guidance and feedback of our REGI partners, and myself and other Just Lead colleagues helped create as well, and commissioned and underwritten by the Office of Civil Legal Aid here in Washington State. That toolkit is specifically focused on helping organizations, particularly legal organizations, understand and incorporate race equity into their work, and includes, in fact, an assessment as well that the toolkit builds around. And that toolkit, it's available online. You can view it at justleadwashington.com/learn/REGI toolkit. And it touches on all different areas of what that looks like internally and externally for an organization. We can circle back to that at the end if folks have questions about that toolkit as well. But part of our context today, as well as of Just Lead's work and REGI's work, is the work that Alliance for Equal Justice does here in Washington State, which is a network of leaders within the law and justice community, particularly focused on civil legal aid, which leads to the visual you have in front of you, which is as part of that effort to focus on equity. These are the state plan, 2018 through 2020, that focuses on how to enhance and expand and overall improve the delivery of civil legal aid for low-income people here in Washington State. And goal number 1 being race equity, and goal 5 being systemic advocacy, which we're going to touch on today, but definitely other goals touching on how that focus of equity and poverty and how that relates to folks who need legal aid here in Washington State. That is kind of the grounding of what we do our work, and wanted to share that as context for all the different areas that we're going to talk about today as well. Awesome. So this is a visual of the types of levels, of what we call the 5 levels of race equity work. So on the left here, we're going to focus specifically today on what race equity work looks like at the systemic, and we're going to touch on the community levels. We have a REGI webinar as well that we can share, that we will share when we send out follow-up info after this webinar today, that focuses on implicit biases and internalized racism, which touches on individual and interpersonal levels that you have in front of you, as well as the internal subconscious levels. And things like the toolkit in particular touch on the organizational, institutional levels as well. The one thing I want to mention with this slide here is all of these levels are important and are necessary and interrelated to be able to undertake and make progress towards racial justice. So today we're going to again be focusing particularly on systemic and community, but to really give an understanding that this work happens across multiple levels, and all the levels are necessary to do that work. So racial equity, just as a foundational term and basis as we move forward, this is the point at which race no longer determines one's outcomes, defined in its most simple form. And it includes, the reinforcement of practices and policies that maintain that point where race no longer determines one's outcomes. That's where we're really centering on when we say race equity and when we say racial justice in particular. Even more basic here, what is race? Well, we are going to move forward in this conversation with the understanding that race is a social construct. And what we mean by that is it has no biological meaning. It was culturally created, maintained, and reinforced, and has been integrated into all the systems that we interact with today. And we'll also talk about how with this idea that race is a social construct, it's an idea, it's an ideology. Ultimately, at its origins, this is how it came to be, and we're going to touch on that. We've also seen it evolve over time. We're going to speak to that a little bit by mentioning essentially how we've seen the legal classification boxes of race change over time on the U.S. Census, for example, to really give an example of how race is evolving and has changed. And it also has always been to further certain political and economic goals, which will ground what we'll talk about today about how race and class intersect. They are actually intrinsically connected to one another, and we actually can't talk about race without talking about class, can't talk about class without talking about race. And we're going to get into that a little bit when we talk about residential segregation and how that ultimately created opportunities and less opportunities for communities of color in contrast to white communities. Particularly low-income communities of color. As a topic of today touches on, we're talking about structural racism. And when we say that race and the ideas of racism as an ideology have been integrated into all the systems that we are part of and that we interact with, we're really talking about how this ideology has been applied and racialized, and how it has racialized the systems that we are part of and that we operate with. So, put more simply, these are all the different ways that we see race-based inequities. The fact that we see race-based inequities is how we know that system, those structures, they have been racialized. And again, we're working towards race equity, so we don't see those disparities across, disproportionately across race. So structural racialization in particular it is not biology, it is not racial slurs, it is not good or bad intentions. In particular, when we say structures and when we talk about structural racism and racialization, it is specifically systemic. We're talking about how it's been institutionalized, and we talked about how it's been internalized, which we're not going to touch on today, but comes back to those 5 levels about our own personal relationship with race and racism. And it's also cultural. And all of that leads to this oppression, this idea that a group based on the race is being marginalized by a dominant group, which in the case of race and racism are particularly white identified communities and white communities in particular. That's what we mean by structural racialization. As we start talking about what these actual inequities look like, well, we start to get into the difference of opportunity being different in some communities over others. So when we think about all the different systems that, let's say, in our personal lives we interact with, we're talking about employment, schools and education, childcare, transportation, all these different areas. and that ultimately creates this different and disparate outcomes that we see across communities of color and white identified communities. One video that I'm going to touch on in particular that will drive this idea home, I'm going to play right now. Give me one moment as I cue this up and make sure audio is working for everyone.
So I've been talking about opportunity. So what is opportunity? First of all, we all live in neighborhoods.
Sorry about that. Let's start that again.
So
Can you tell people can hear?
Everyone can hear that, right? Before I restart it? Cool. Getting some yeses. Awesome. Awesome.
So I've been talking about opportunity. So what is opportunity? First of all, we all live in neighborhoods called opportunity structures. And in those structures, there are houses, there are schools, there are supermarkets, there are jobs, there's a political participation or not. And those things interact, and they create a sense of opportunity or isolation from opportunity. So it's the interaction of all of these things together that creates today what I would call the opportunity structure. And if you think of people who have high opportunity, they're standing or going up an up escalator. Escalators going toward opportunity. If they just stand there, they will get to opportunity. They will get to a decent life. Some of them will fall off, so not everyone on the escalator will get to high opportunity. And then others who live in low opportunity have to run up a down escalator. It doesn't mean they won't get there, but it means they have to exert much more energy in order for it to happen. And opportunity in this country is deeply, profoundly racialized. When you look at areas in the country where there's stripped opportunity, where whole communities are isolated from opportunities, those are much more likely to be Black and Latino communities. Now you might say, well, that has nothing to do with race. This is about poverty, isn't it? And even if that was true, that would be bad enough, but it's not just about poverty. If you're Black living in urban areas in the United States and poor, you're 10 times more likely to live in low opportunity areas than if you're white and poor. And it's not much better if you're Latino or even if you're in the rural areas. So if you had to choose, knowing nothing else, just look at these communities. Which community would you choose? You would choose an area for you, your family, your kids, as close to opportunity as possible. And what's the difference? So in Detroit today, 25% graduation rate for students going to school in Detroit. Less than 20% if you're African American male. I live in a place now where my stepdaughter graduated from high school. 100% of her classmates graduated from high school and 100% went to college. And it's an area that's relatively safe. In fact, one of the main things the police do is to arrest kids who are trying to sneak in this community to steal a good education and send them back to a school system like the one in Detroit.
That was Professor John Powell, who actually has a really great analysis that and that we use. A former attorney really speaks to that intersection of race and class and those opportunity pieces. And one way that I really like to be able to talk about those different opportunities is what he was speaking about how ultimately racialized policies like residential segregation create those disparate outcomes when it comes to opportunities. So, we see these disparities between schools, whether it's the achievement gap or discipline rates, and how that connects, for example, the school to prison pipeline, all these different ways that ultimately economic segregation is created through residential segregation. And this visual, for example, to reference what Professor Powell was speaking to, the visual on the screen is It's 8 Mile Road in Detroit, Michigan. This is actually a very distinctive line. One side being, communities of color, and the other side being white communities. And this is, I believe, a car insurance quote. And this was just from a difference in what side of that road you were on. And this was recently. This was a few years back. So, although I will get into history of residential segregation, I will eventually ask a query for folks to share, what other ways do we see kind of the echoes of the history that I'm going to share kind of enter into the present day. And this example of, what a car insurance code and plenty of other examples of how, based on where you live, race still matters and plays a difference in your opportunities and your outcomes. So residential segregation is a very, very important case study, if you will. And this is something, I also do some work in public health, and public health is also studying not only race equity and understanding how all of these issues of structural racism affect our overall health and well-being. But they've done some research in particular on residential segregation as well. So for example, that direct tie, how it influences health by concentrating poverty and environmental pollutants in certain areas over others, which, studies have also found, increased risk of cancer with air pollution, and, ultimately connecting residential segregation with negative mortality rates as well. And in one analysis, and this is just one study, a really startling number that estimated segregation is responsible for 176,000 deaths annually. So really this idea of how all these things intersect, it is a very important piece to consider as far as how all of these affect our overall health and well-being, how they affect our day-to-day. And it also speaks to the multidisciplinary aspect of when we talk about race equity, how many different systems it touches, and how they're interrelated with each other, which we're going to touch on later today after we get through these different topics on structural racism. So that residential segregation I was referring to, well, we know that specifically that began in a very institutional way beginning in 1934. I say institutional way because it was happening already prior to that. But in 1934, we saw when the Federal Housing Administration, which is now the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, was created, we saw redlining, this practice of redlining begin. And that specifically and literally marked red lines around quote unquote undesirable neighborhoods, which were essentially communities of color. And this was a way to provide mortgages and control the housing system in ways that denied communities of color, marginalized, racialized groups, and keep them away from quote unquote white neighborhoods. And we also saw those same sort of approaches get integrated into deeds for homes and white-only clauses that stipulated who could and who could not own property in certain parts of town. And this speaks back to all these different ways opportunity is concentrated in some communities and low opportunities concentrated in others. So for example, this is Tacoma, Washington. This is a redlining map of Tacoma, Washington. So the green here being best and the red being hazardous. And this is a great resource as well, mapping inequality, Redlining New Deal America, which has redlining maps from across the country, because this is something that happened not only across Washington State, but in every state, in every urban and rural area. So this is Tacoma, for example, and these sort of residential segregation is an important piece to connect to how the legacy of redlining kind of speaks to now, because we still see that concentration of opportunity and low and high opportunity in different areas. We see this is the redlining map of Spokane, Washington. Again, with that same legend of green being best and red being hazardous. And we see that the neighborhoods and the reasons why the neighborhood is shaped a certain way, why the racial demographics are a certain way. Often I think for many of us who, have lived in different communities, we wonder, how, what those shifts in demographics have looked like and why they are the way they are. And when we really look at redlining, we really see that it is not a coincidence that one community is predominantly white or one community is predominantly Black, African, Latinx, or what have you. These are all from intentional, structural forms of racism that were institutionalized through policy and sanctioned by state and federal government in our history. Racial covenants, this is what I was referring to as far as house deeds. So we saw on house deeds these white-only clauses. So for example, this language often is similar, but I pulled two examples, one from Spokane, Washington, and the other in Bellingham, Spokane and Whatcom County. And it specifically states that no race or nationally other than the white race shall use or occupy any building or own any land unless there are domestic servants of a different race. So again, we see how people of color were allowed on these properties only if they were domestic servants. And we saw that written in house deeds. And of course, these house deeds and the practice of it was outlawed, but you will still might find this language on house deeds today. They haven't necessarily been removed. So we still see this language. It's not illegal to act on them. But in many cases, after even redlining was outlawed and this practice outlawed, we still saw for a decade and the decades following, folks still including this language. And again, it really speaks to the legacy of how our communities came to be. Speaking of all these different policies, we're talking about redlining, talking about racial covenants, these different policies and practices that kind of led to the race inequities that we see today. This is a lot of text on this slide. Definitely, I'm not expecting folks to read through all this, but I'm going to highlight three of them. Because, when we see residential segregation, that came and happened in the shadows of Jim Crow laws. It came as mass incarceration was being built and increasing after the enslavement of those of African descent. All of these things are connected, interrelated. At the same time, we saw multiple pieces of policies and legislation that focus on immigration. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today as an important piece of when we talk about structural racism. What are those important pieces? So for example, in 1790, the Naturalization Act, it's one of the first acts of Congress. That legislation stated that to be a U.S. citizen, you had to be free, you had to be white, and you had to be of good moral character. That last one, I don't know how they gauge that one. But again, this is the origins of how the systems that we now interact with, and when they were set up, how they became racialized. So that was one of the first acts of Congress was the Naturalization Act. When we see things like the travel ban, the Muslim ban happening today, we know that in history, that is actually not new. That is something that has happened repeatedly in the history of this country. One of the more notable examples, and there are several, was the Chinese Exclusion Act. When we saw a influx of Chinese immigration from China, in particular to feed. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. When we saw the immigration from China starting to happen to fill a need for labor, we saw also the Chinese Exclusion Act come to play, which specifically barred immigration from China. And we saw other acts of legislation that limited immigration for those of Eastern European descent. We saw it banned from those of African and Middle Eastern descent. So really, the Muslim ban, the travel ban, is just a repeat of what we've seen our country and part of the history of racism in our country. The last point I want to make is it was a particular Supreme Court case. And this is Supreme Court U.S. versus Thind, and which is highlighted on the bottom. This case, along with many other cases, were instances where folks of color, people of color, those who are immigrants, those who are not native and born here in the United States, pretty much contested their right for citizenship through various means, either because of their Aryan background, of the language they speak, the certain amount of years they've lived in the country, all different ways to justify their qualifications for citizenship. And in each case, we've seen those cases ruling in favor of deferring to what is the common perception of white. So we saw this idea of what is white be protected. And the most clear example of that is actually one that's very personal to me. Someone who is an immigrant, someone who is from Iran. One thing that you quickly notice if you're of Middle Eastern descent and North African descent here in the United States is that legally, folks of Middle Eastern, North African descent are considered white. And, growing up, that never made sense. Most folks in Middle Eastern, North African communities, it doesn't make sense to them. And in many ways, we ignore that box until we realize that we'll get put in that box either way. But that reason for Middle Eastern, North African folks being considered as white actually comes back to a case it was in Venice, California, and it was an instance of it was a Syrian Lebanese policeman, in fact, who made an arrest. And the arrest they made was someone whose father was a prominent lawyer. After that arrest, the lawyer contested that, the policeman who made the arrest is of Middle Eastern descent and therefore not white and therefore not a citizen. So therefore their arrest should be thrown out. It should not stand. So this case went to California Supreme Court, and the judge, in fact, ruled in favor of the policeman, actually. And why he did that was the policeman said that if I am Mongoloid, which is what the lawyer of the person he arrested was stating, this police officer is Mongoloid and their arrest should not stand, not a citizen. The police officer said, when the judge ruled in his favor, if I'm Mongoloid, then so is Jesus, because we came from the same land. That set a legal precedent for those of Middle Eastern, North African descent being considered white, to again protect what is whiteness. And there's plenty of other history of how that connects to, the dominant, Christian and how religion plays a role into this as well. To only imagine Jesus as only being white. Again, this is how we've seen race evolve and change. The 2020 census, there's been a big push the last 10 years for folks in the Middle Eastern, North African community to change that box. And actually, it was going to change up until the current administration, and that effort was halted, in fact. And so that effort was years in the making, but we've seen, again, the community is not being heard and listened to as far as what is still, this idea of putting people in these race boxes, but we also see the U.S. Census, which accounts for billions of dollars to different communities based on how it gets filled out, what the results come by, and how it decides different opportunities and resources that get given out to folks in different communities. So again, we're connecting that back to the now and how that plays out. Another piece of when we talk about structural racism is absolutely talking about the occupied land that we work on, that we learn and live our lives every day on. This image is just going to keep running through for folks to get an idea of the scope of native indigenous land that the U.S. now occupies. We know in Washington State that history and relationship with Native indigenous communities is particularly strong. If you're in the Seattle area, the Puget Sound area, we know that we are on the land of the Coast Salish peoples, in particular the Duwamish tribe, which is not a federally recognized tribe. They were, but they haven't been for some time, despite their efforts again to be able to really be autonomous and be their own sovereign nation, but also have access to the resources, which in many cases they were promised. In Washington State, one piece of history is the Treaty of Yakima, which was in 1855, and this was specifically a treaty between the U.S. government officials and 14 Native American leaders that ceded 11 million acres to white settlers in Washington State. It's actually what brought together the Yakima Nation in particular. And this took away most of the land that they and their ancestors had lived on for thousands of years, and included that they would have exclusive use of millions, 1.3 million acres, with the authority to govern itself, with access to fish freely and really maintain and continue the practices of their own communities. We saw that treaty was violated less than 2 weeks later, and actually led to the Yakima War. I'm not clear on any treaty that was made between the U.S. federal government and Native indigenous communities that has been honored. So again, we stand, when we talk about structural racism, we are talking about many different things, but we're talking about the residential segregation piece in the shadows of Jim Crow and chattel slavery in the United States. We're talking about the violation of treaties, colonialism, and the genocide of Native and indigenous communities, and that forced assimilation that U.S. federal programs created and implemented on and forced upon Native indigenous communities. And we also see the theme of anti-immigration laws and this idea of foreignness seen again and again, and that we absolutely see today. At this point, I would love to get some thoughts over the chat box on a question. This is not a comprehensive set of history. It is a foundational piece of history of structural racism. But my question is, what are areas that you see in your work today that echo some of this history that I've shared? And maybe other pieces of history that we haven't touched on today, because there certainly are more. What ways does this history echo in your work is my question. I would love to get some thoughts from folks in the chat box of different ways they see this history connect to the present day in their work or what they see out and about.
Give them a few minutes.
So I had one respondent say, their office is all white, as the way that history gets echoed. I had another person say how most Christian congregations are composed of one race or ethnic group. So we see how that, kind of the role of religion and dominant Christian norms play out into that as well. That question isn't, I think, an important question to answer because history has already repeated itself, and really what we want to do is study history, study what has changed and what has not changed. And this really grounds and provides context and perspective to the work we are doing today, because none of the race inequities that we see are a coincidence. All of it has been intentional, explicit in our history. And we can say that in latter decades, we have seen unintentional inequities across race get created. But what we would say to that is that puts on an extra responsibility for those of us who are a part of these systems to really understand what a race equity lens looks like and how can we be explicit about our race equity so we can avoid unintentional outcomes, because we've seen so much of the history of the United States lead to white supremacy, and lead to those explicit practices of how racism came to be. This is very grounded in history, and we've seen, different ways how this way of explicit race equity has been diluted into, I'm seeing on the chat thread, diversity trainings, multiculturalism, when really, race and racism has a profound impact on each of our lives, but has a profound impact on the health and well-being of our neighbors, of our communities. And so really the task is really understanding all this history and being explicit and figuring out ways to build relationships to be able to do that work. Cool. And before I hand off to Ada here, I just want to share one more thought I'm hearing on the thread. And this was a share from someone in the Tri-Cities, in particular focusing on Pasco, Kennewick, and Richland, and making note that each of those cities has a very specific makeup, with Pasco being majority Latinx and Richland being majority white. So again, we see the same pattern. This was happening across Washington State, across the country. And again, it's not a coincidence, but now is our responsibility to understand them as part of these systems and figure out what can we do to apply that new lens and be more intentional and deliberate in our work, more explicit. Oh, I have one more slide left. Ada's chuckling over here. Okay, so this is, I wanted to end, we heard Professor Powell speak earlier. I wanted to end with a really great framework that he uses, and this is about the circle of human concern. And I was pretty much saying it just now, but this idea of how we have seen through our policies and this intentional policies and practices of racism essentially create who belongs in the circle of human concern and who does not belong in it. So if you're in the in-group, if you are a person who is white, we have seen history tell us, and we've seen our systems tell us today that you deserve and have a sense of belonging in society because of that dominant white norm and culture. In contrast, we've seen communities of color and inequities we see and violence and all these different ways we've seen racism play out today give a sense of exclusion to these communities. And ultimately, we want to work towards not only everyone being in that circle of human concern, but also ensuring that there is no one deciding who can be in and outside of this circle of human concern. Everyone deserves that sense of belonging. So it really speaks to this bigger picture that we're working towards. And I think is really important when we're talking about race equity, because we're working against a lot of accumulation of really deep and profound racialized history that makes up, and creates certainly the tall task and work that we all have in front of us today. That's my last slide.
No, it isn't.
It's not. Oh, snap. Okay, Ada's on it more than I am this morning. Hello, everyone. This slide is simple and sweet. Structures, these systems, they are not neutral. They have been racialized. So despite our best intentions, they will operate as they were designed, which is to create these race inequities unless we do something to change them. And the way we do that is through using a system thinking analysis and being very explicit with our race equity. So again, that impact and those inequities we see, that has to be our focus. And whether or not we have good intentions or not, these structures, because they've been racialized, will continue to not operate as neutral. So acting as if they are will only maintain and in many cases worsen those inequities. Am I good, Ada?
You're good.
She's
you're
good. All right.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It's Ada. And I work with Omid and Jen at Just Lead as a senior education consultant. I think that's the title Jen has given me. And so I just have a few quick introductory remarks, one of which is that on the video, Professor John Powell is listed as at the Kirwan Institute, and he's long since moved on to the Haas Institute at UC Berkeley, where he has 100 fellows at the law school that are working explicitly on race equity, which is very exciting. And I also wanted to mention that John Powell started his career as a civil legal aid attorney for Evergreen Legal Services here in Washington State in the Central District. I don't want me to be the only person who remembers that, so now you all have been deputized to know that and have those bragging rights. And then I would also like to just mention that this part, which is looking at systems and strategic thinking, is a refresher for any of you who have been through Leadership Academy or going through Leadership Academy. So think of it as a refresher. For those of you who have not yet been through the Just Lead Equity and Justice Community Leadership Academy, this will be a quick introduction. And I know many of you have done work already in systems thinking. So to some extent, all of us are in it. And this is just trying to get us using the same language, aligning our language. And I will start by linking into Omid's last comment, which looking at the circle of human concern drawing, which if we could go back to that drawing. To me, the work that we do is about dismantling the circle entirely, because the circle is a construct that is used to exclude certain groups of people, and who's getting to decide that, which we just got introduced or reintroduced to through Omid's presentation. But not only who gets to decide who's in and who's outside of the circle of human concern, but equally importantly, to who's getting to decide it is who's benefiting and who's getting most harmed by that decision. So our work is really dismantling that whole construction that allows certain groups of people to have the unearned privilege and entitlement sense that they get to say on Tuesday that unaccompanied children coming across the border are people, human beings that we're sympathetic to, little 8-year-old kid. But by Thursday, the Circle of Human Concern has rebranded them as disease carriers. So the neat trick of dehumanizing and devaluing certain groups. And that is entirely in the service of throwing them outside of the circle. So that's how the system works. And our work in equity and justice has to be about not allowing that to happen. Okay, so the next slide, thank you. So we're looking now, we're turning to strategic thinking. We know about the structures that perpetuate racialization, as well as other forms of structural oppression, because they often compound, as Omid said, with not only poverty, but certainly misogyny, ableism, and other forms of oppression as well. And so here we're looking at underlying structures, cause and effect relationships, and interdependence among various parts of a whole. So the goal is to come up with effective, feasible solutions to address the underlying causes of, in this case, poverty and racialization, and the compounding biases. So that's the goal of looking at systems thinking. So why do we do it? Next slide. I'm going to let Omid make this reference to a meme that I don't understand because of generational issues.
I included this meme because it, I think, speaks to that the process of dismantling systemic racism is certainly by pretending it doesn't exist, but the meme is really just a reference to any Lord of the Rings fans out there, that one does not simply dismantle systemic racism by acting like it doesn't exist, which falls in our theme of us being really explicit in applying that race equity lens to do our work.
Thank you. Well, for me, I thought it was like the Game of Thrones or something, so that's why I have to have somebody explain what it is. So if we're looking at, can they see the whole slide? Or
they can.
Is that, okay. Um, so why use systems thinking? So we're trying to put things into context, which was the whole front end of this webinar. Use a holistic approach, which is one of the things on the state plan wheel that we use, holistic client-centered approaches. This slide is kind of covered up, but we're looking at whether a particular problem is situational, relational, or historical. And I would say for most of the complex problems, we're looking at homelessness, school to prison pipeline, and mass incarceration, those kinds of problems, and looking at our day-to-day work through these historic and ongoing lenses, that it's all of these. It might come up for us with a kid who's being suspended or expelled, for example, by the Tukwila School District. It could then bleed over into the relationships that the administration of a particular school district have, not only with communities of color that they're supposed to be serving, but also with law enforcement, cozy arrangements with police that are based on rampant implicit biases against communities of color. And then you have all the historical underpinnings that in the slide that Omid showed you with the 5 levels are all interrelated. You've got a school principal and a police officer who may not fully understand the history and the implicit biases they carry at the individual level, interpersonally, organizationally as part of a school district or law enforcement, and so forth. So to reveal the power arrangements, rules, and norms, like who's making the decisions, who's throwing whom outside of the circle of human concern, certainly looking at interconnections between systems, individuals, and communities, to look at root causes, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, and what's contributing to the problem, even well-meaning interventions which can inadvertently worsen the problem. And then to look at leverage points, which is pretty far down the line after you've thought about what is the system. And then how to generate strategic options to intervene in the problem. So next we'll look at qualities of systems. So let's see, before we do that, I'm sorry to jump around, but my notes are written in chicken scratch here. So why use systems thinking? I would also just add a piece to this, which is what's the harm in not using systems thinking? Aside from us understanding that we're moving into problem solving without the whole picture, the cliche of we're holding on to the left leg of the elephant and we think it's a tree trunk, and others are looking at the trunk and thinking it's something else. And so we only have a partial picture. So I'm going to use 2 quick examples here. One is an old case from the late 70s, early 80s, where legal aid was representing the Washington Association of Retarded Citizens, which of course wouldn't be called that today, but it was in the 70s and 80s. And the clients wanted to be deinstitutionalized from a horrible, horrible warehousing facility that was inhumane and out of date. And they wanted it closed down. And so we represented them. And in fact, we got a court ruling to shut it down. I say we, this was before my time, but I would claim this as part of our inability to do a system scan. So after winning that, there was a huge backlash because the families of the deinstitutionalized disabled people had no capacity, resources, or expertise to handle their family member who now had no place to be. And furthermore, the communities where we were trying to set up community-based alternatives to mass warehousing in an out-of-date 1862 horrible oppressive building, we're experiencing NIMBYism, not in my backyard, dynamics all over the place. So we did not think that through. And as a result, there was a terrible crisis, and who knows what happened to many of these people. Some of them ended up homeless. Some of them probably ended up prematurely dying. So this is inexcusable in our work to not have scanned the whole big picture, and that was an early horrible, tragic lesson. The other shorter example, which I often use, many of you have heard this, is that a major teaching hospital in Boston had to change their emergency room, update and upgrade it, and it was next door to the waiting room. And they said, well, the waiting room's always horribly overcrowded, the air conditioning can't handle it, and people are on the floor sitting there for hours, and they're already stressed out waiting for their loved one in the ER. So let's expand the waiting room while we're fixing the emergency room. So they did, they doubled it, and within 3 weeks, that emergency room that was double the size was just as bad. It was terrible. And so they said, oh my gosh, it didn't help anything. So they brought in these consultants. And after 3 months, the consultants sat down with the hospital administration and they asked them a series of questions. The questions were, how many seats in a waiting room do you think you need from an Anglo family? And they said, well, we don't know. 2. You need 2 because the daughter comes and then she calls the brother and at 5:30 and says, I got to go home, make dinner. It's your turn. So they might overlap for a while. So that's 2. How many seats in the waiting room do you think you need for an African-American family? And they said, we don't know. And they said 7 because there's multi-generational family members that come and, you know, grandchildren, grandparents, and so forth. How many seats do you think you need for a Latinx family? And they said, we don't know. And they said 15 because they're bringing in a huge extended family at any given time, multi-generationally. And so you did not understand the demographics of who you are serving here and who your patient population is. And that's why you underestimated the expansion by a factor of 4 times. So that was a, $41 million down the drain because they didn't do their scan. They didn't do their system thinking approach, looking at it holistically. Who are we serving? What are the demographics? And then what are the differential needs? So those are 2 examples of, what's the consequence if you don't engage in this? So this slide, qualities of systems, really just is a way of deconstructing the idea that we all understand of ecosystems, that if you take away a critical piece of an ecosystem, however big or small, which could be a small insect that we're sometimes not even aware is part of the eco chain, that the entire system is thrown into disarray. In our case, with racialization, we want to put it in disarray because we are attempting on purpose to disrupt an ecosystem which perpetuates racial oppression and other forms of oppression. So if you don't understand that there's an ecosystem in place where each of the pieces of the ecosystem are reinforcing each other, sometimes without even knowing it, then there's no way we're going to be able to come up with cause and effect diagnosis and an understanding of how to break the loops that reinforce each other, that are the loops we don't want reinforced. We want to create a disruption on purpose. And so, disruptions are events like Flint, Michigan, Ferguson, Katrina, that Dr. Leticia Nieto says there's the hum of racism, which is all around us. It's like the background noise of the air conditioning system in your room, wherever you are, or the street noise, and you tune it out. And every once in a while, there's like the clap, the disruptive clap. And what we're about is making the disruptive clap, using them when they come along societally to walk through and push open until there's enough disruption to change the status quo. Next slide. Okay, so this iceberg is just a reminder to all of us, which is something we learned probably by the 3rd grade, which is that in many cases, as with an iceberg, you can only see 20% of the iceberg above the waterline, and under the waterline is 80%. So this is a problem if you're not looking all the way down to the root causes of a particular problem, which is, of course, what looking at structural racialization is all about. We're looking at root causes and the intertwining of race and poverty. And that's, of course, compounded by sexism, ableism, and other forms of bias and oppression. So this is just a reminder of that. And then how do we get to moving to some tools, really quick tools. This is called the 5 Whys. Those of you who are anywhere around young children around the age of 3 also know this as the perpetual why question. Like, we can't go there for dinner. Why? Because, blah, blah, blah. Why? But it's really a handy tool when you're looking at the Tukwila School District for the last few years has never sent a white child to the juvenile detention facility. They've only sent kids of color. Okay, why? And then you just keep going down because of the implicit bias of the chief security officer at the school. And you know why? Because the school district is allowing there to be insufficient training of the security officers. Why is that? Because there's not enough budget in the Tukwila school system to uptrain. Why? Because they haven't put anti-oppression and race equity at the forefront of what their employee training is. Why haven't they done that? And so forth. So you get the idea that you have to just keep going until you sort of meet yourself back around at the top. And it's a really handy way to get a team of people onto the same page, because otherwise what happens is you have a great team of, say, 4 people working on a project, but they're all starting at a different stage of the why. They're coming in assuming that it's because the policy of King County is X, but because they've been involved in the equity and social justice work of the county, and they're operating at a very highly woke level, and they're very knowledgeable. Somebody else is operating at a very different level of just coming into this question and problem. And so you have to align everybody to, where are we at with understanding all of the possibilities around the problem. Okay, so it's a useful, handy tool. Anybody can do it. So how do you begin a systems analysis? So I think we're making these slides available to everybody on the webinar, so we don't have to go into all of these in such a short period of time. But this is just really a checklist. So if you're going to start to do a systems analysis of a particular problem in your community through a race equity lens, you're going to be looking at what are the racial inequities involved in the problem, who's the most harmed by it, and who gets off and gets an advantage, even if the advantage is they don't pay the same price that people or communities of color have to pay. And I would just add an asterisk to this one, which is a lot of times we as advocates aren't even prepared to do number one because we don't have the data. So some of what the race equity toolkit is designed to do is start to upgrade our ability to reach into data. So as Omid knows, coming from public health, there's a ton of completely complementary analogous data in the health arena to what it is we're looking at in disproportionate lack of access, for example, to health care for poor kids of color and so forth. We don't have to reinvent data, but we often don't know where to find it. And then when we find it, we don't know how to frame it in terms of advocacy. So that's a big piece in just figuring out what are the racial inequities other than what's coming through our door or through the clear hotline at NJP or through our outreach, which is important, certainly, but sometimes the complementary use of data puts us into hyper power when we're trying to make the case for change. And then looking at the institutions that are involved. And in many cases here, if we just look at the school to prison pipeline as an example, when I started, nobody even had that language. It was just like a kid was disciplined and it was an individual problem or it was a family problem. We certainly didn't look at the school system as being directly connected in any way to the juvenile justice system. And now we understand that that was a failure on our part to see the linkages between the involved institutions. So that's another important step in systems analysis. Social conditions. We're looking specifically in this case at race and poverty, but you might be looking in a piece of advocacy at other things as well. And then we've been talking about the compounding dynamics. So you have people seeking immigration status who are people of color who don't speak English, and they may have suffered from domestic violence. And so where do you start to deconstruct all of this, the race dynamics, the poverty dynamics, and so forth? It's exhausting, but it has to be done. Otherwise, you're just pushing at one spot of a compounded problem for the client community that we're serving. There are a few other things on the next slide related to doing a systems scan or analysis, looking at what cultural norms, myths, or popular ideas justify or maintain the problem. So to look at criminal justice, for example, in the 1800s, coming from England, the dominant idea behind the criminal justice system was crime and punishment. It was deterrence of future crime, and we've added in the ensuing century things like public safety, rehabilitation, and if you look at reform language, for those of us who are in progressive reform movements, our language doesn't talk about any of that stuff. We're talking about trauma-informed and restorative justice and collaborative justice and community-based solutions and community policing. And so if you look at the iceberg, the dominant ideas are the 80% under the waterline. And if we keep pecking at the top 2% on restorative justice, we can't move anything. So we have to deal with the cultural norms. We may reject them, but we have to reckon with how we're going to advocate in ways that break those down. And then history is everything that Omid talked about before. So at the bottom of this slide, we have some of the goals, like at the end of your scan, will you understand better what the root causes are? And also position yourself to have a better handle on what solutions and strategic interventions might result in some lasting change. Okay, let's see, how am I doing on time?
Good.
All right, so in selecting strategies for systems change, I think the first and most important thing is grounding making sure your context is grounded in, and the development of your strategies and interventions are grounded in the lived experience of those who are most directly affected by the systems that are perpetuating structural oppression. If we're not grounding it on that, then it's just policy wonking or us having our own ideas in an elitist law and justice system. And we like to say lawyers on tap to the communities that we're working shoulder to shoulder with, not lawyers on top, which is difficult to maintain in a structural system that's an elitist profession. It's a monopoly, and it's very, very white supremacist created and dominated. The second is to conduct a systems analysis, which we just went through in the 2 green slides before. It's like how is, but through the 5 levels. So remember the slide that had concentric circles that kept moving off like sound waves to the left from the picture of the brain. Could we go back there? Is it possible to do it without wrecking sequence? Let's see which slide it is. Oh, That's handy, yeah. So it's this one just for a second, so you know when we're talking about the 5 levels, if you're working with us at Reggie, we'll be referencing these 5 levels all the time, and the 5 levels come from the Shriver Center and the team that created the toolkit. So, you know, we keep referencing this, and my little editorial comment about this is whenever you go into a space that is rife with conflict about race equity, so say the Juvenile Detention Center, a controversy here in Seattle, King County, what you can decipher using this tool of 5 levels is that people are coming at you with disagreement are often operating at the individual and interpersonal level. Like they have implicit biases, they're giving you a white fragility response, defensive, I'm not a racist response. And the communities of color that are most harmed by the oppression are looking at it like Black Lives Matter, don't cage my children of color. So they're coming at it from the opposite end, from the systemic and the community level. And if you understand that there's no meeting of the minds, even in initiating a conversation about the problem, you can see why everybody just goes around and around endlessly in disagreement circles. So to get back to the slide, thanks for indulging me in that. So now we're in the key stakeholders. Oh, wait, I think I didn't do number 3. Did I? So, yeah, so number 3 on this slide is, yeah, number 2 is the different levels. So you're going to be looking at all the different levels where structural racialization and misogyny and poverty are compounding themselves in each other to perpetuate and maintain an oppressive status quo. And then the third level is you have to do a scan where you can figure out what strategies are likely to create transformative change. And in this, in many cases, and I'll use the creation of Team Child as an example. So years ago, everybody recognized we didn't know what we were, not us, but the system didn't know what it was doing with these kids who were dropping between the cracks between the criminal justice system or juvenile justice system, if it is a system, and the civil legal aid community. So in civil legal aid, we knew about EPSDT screening and special education, but we didn't have the body of the child. And then the public defenders had the body of the child, but they didn't know anything about special ed laws or EPSDT screening and so forth. So the kids were dropping between the cracks. And because the whole system understood that they were failing at dealing with these children, that offered a transformative opportunity where when systems are failing and it's a crisis, you can walk in with a potential solution and have much more leeway to attempt an experiment, you know, to try to do something different. So our ability to scan for those strategic opportunities and then leverage the hell out of them for change, that's another important skill when you're engaging in systems change work. Okay, so in this slide, we're looking at key stakeholder involvement. So let's just use the example of homelessness. So, you know, homelessness prevention and eradication is now a gazillion-dollar industry, and you have direct services staff at local, regional, and statewide levels. Very complex web of interacting agencies and sometimes competing in either duplicative or not productive competitive ways. You have leaders of homeless service organizations such as shelters or food delivery or counseling. You have the people who are homeless themselves, having the direct lived experience of homelessness. You have members of the public ranging from how can we have homeless people living here in one of the richest states in the nation to dehumanization statements like, I don't want to see them, why are they here, why can't somebody, you know, get rid of whatever. And then you have policymakers who are wringing their hands because they keep launching things like the 10-year Eradication of Homelessness Initiative, which not only don't succeed, but are understood to be abject failures. And then you have funders who are funding either at the governmental or the private sector or otherwise funding attempted responses to deal with the rise in homelessness and the sort of chronic infliction of the state of homelessness on human beings. And then you see the gold one with the question marks in it is like, who is missing from this? So if you're looking at homelessness, or use a complex problem you're looking at in your work, who's missing from this? So if you take a moment and start typing, who would you add to this little scan here beyond direct services staff and people who are homeless? What's missing from this picture of everybody you would want to be sure you understood how to place in thinking, brainstorming a solution, or being obstacles to effective change. So if you would take just a few moments to type in there, the chat pod, who's missing as a stakeholder, that would be great.
One.
Scholars, yes, for sure. And people who are formerly homeless, yeah, who probably know better than anyone how they got out of homelessness. Neighbors and passersby. Law enforcement, that's huge. Yep. I might add business owners, who often are the, get them out of my entryway, their driving away business, et cetera, et cetera. Landlords, yep. Okay, well, this is a great way to update our little diagram, teachers and educators. Excellent, great. Okay, we're on the home stretch here, just 2 more slides. So this one is just a little bit of practice. And so I'm just going to remind you of the 5 levels is not only 5 levels for how we're looking at structural racialization, but also there are different levels at how we're dealing with racialization and how what kinds of responses we have to things that are racialized and what categories they fall into, so that we're aware of what level we're operating at. So there are 3 different kinds of problems, but they are all related. So there's the individual level problem. So I referenced before a particular school district that has a certain suspension or expulsion policy that results in hugely disproportionate kids of color ending up with a record in the juvenile justice system. They or their family are experiencing horrible obstacles to renting a place to live, to getting a job, and so forth. And so we might partner, as CLS does with Fair Start, to help people understand how to remove barriers to reentry as individual people. How do we expunge their juvenile record? How do we seal their juvenile records? And although we might try to create infrastructure to reach a lot of them, it's still essentially a 1-by-1 person remedy. And so it's important, because for every judge who we wake up to the fact that this is interfering with reentry and that it shouldn't be a lifelong sentence to never find a place to live or get a job, that is a really slow way to make progress. So ideally, you would complement that with institutional level change. So pushing for community-owned diversion, restorative justice programs, and that might mean convincing the county council, the county commissioners to reallocate resources in a certain way, just as we just saw the administration move FEMA money into detention money. We would go the opposite way, which is trying to have policymakers and resource allocators shift to race equity-based allocations of resources. So we would again need data to do it, and we would need an alternative proposal in order to do an institutional change level solution. And then finally, a systemic or addressing the root causes of a racialized policy. This is sort of the moving into the magic wand arena. We would have to alter the way the education system. You could substitute housing system. You could substitute healthcare system. Any of those opportunity circles that John Powell talked about, and make sure that there are targeted equity efforts so that everybody has their fundamental needs met, and some sort of equity in opportunity. So economic opportunity, opportunity to have access to healthful foods, not live in a food desert, all those things that compound to create lack of quality of life. And John Powell, we haven't linked this, but John Powell has a term that he's also coined called targeted universalism, which we can get you some. It took me a while to understand what it was, but basically it is this idea. It's that everybody doesn't start from the same place because of the history of racialization that Omid took us through. And in order to get everybody to a place where they actually can benefit in any way, shape, or form to economic opportunity, we have to first have some sort of targeted universalism in how we offer the opportunities. Habilitation, it's also been called that. And then I think our last slide, right on time.
Short discussion.
Yeah, is a discussion. Is that okay? Yeah. So here's a discussion for the chat pod, and these are the 3 questions in the chat pod. We hope you'll give us some input. What system or systems are you a part of and interact with? So we've talked about all different systems. You could use the specifics of the work that you do, or you could go broader than that. You could look at your whole organization or the entire alliance, or you being a part of your community. In what ways are these systems racialized? And then what types of systems thinking strategies do you think would be needed to create systems level change? So just start thinking about those. They're all related to each other, and type in any thoughts that you have.
And we'll give a minute or 2 for folks to talk about this, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end for Q&A. So we'll give you all a few minutes to reflect and discuss.
Okay, everybody, that is a great list. It's everything. I mean, that's one thing is for those of you who want to see everything, you have to change the setting. But you can see this list is everything. It's the intersectionality between the civil, criminal, and juvenile justice systems, which our respective systems have to work affirmatively to break down, because the way it affects communities of color in particular is that these three systems reverberate in ways that amplify the harm to them in particular. So those who are watching without a chat box, let's go back to the top. I'll read it out very quickly so you can get the idea. So we're talking about systems like the banking and financial system, criminal justice system through, this is somebody from Spokane, the Race Equity Subcommittee of the Spokane Regional Law and Justice Council, which is an amazing entity. Also policymakers, somebody responded, too many systems to count, the entire system reinforces itself. The confused manner in which data is collected differently, for example, or data that is not forthcoming. And I will say that I've worked with a number of jurisdictions where county commissioners literally said, and I'm quoting here, if we collect data, it will make us look bad, so let's not collect data. And then, of course, Ben Carson at HUD, his first act was to stop collecting data disaggregated by race. So great, the ostrich in the sand approach to policy making, and changes in social settings to be more inclusive outside of work. And in this, we can send you a little bunch of slides that talk about debiasing, and debiasing having four main arenas, which are motivation to debias, which sometimes is a crisis, and sometimes it's just people wanting to become more woke as they realize that they have unearned privilege or don't. The second after motivation is exposure, which is a really great suggestion being raised here, to other lived experience and diversity differences, which is on all of us, not the burden on the person who's different than us to educate us. And then the other is the environment. So when you go to the Temple of Justice or the Washington State Bar Association, it's a literal wall of all white men until you get to the very end where you start to see some gender diversity and very, very rarely any kind of racial diversity at all, except for one or two people. And then the last one is policy change. What kind of policy changes can alter behavior? And so recently the Supreme Court passed GR 37, which requires this whole set of hurdles to prove that you're not race biased in jury selection. So that's an example. So we'll digest all of these comments. These are incredibly helpful to us as we move forward. And any support that you need after this webinar, questions that come up once we sign off here, you know where to reach us. Omid's just put up his little Twitter thing and his email address. So thank you so much for taking the time. We're inspired by how many of you have taken the time to join us for this webinar, but we need your feedback to make the next one better. Definitely look out for an email, kind of follow up from today. Definitely check out a Regi website. That's at the top of the slide, waregi.org. If you're interested in being a Regi partner, please feel free to email me directly, omidb@justleavewad.org. Follow us on Twitter. We also have a mailing list if folks are interested as well to get tuned for other future webinars and other events that Regi has going. So thank you, everyone. Please stay in touch and look out for that email. Thanks so much. Bye. Be well.